come to order. If we can do roll call, please.
Councilmember Jimenez.
Here, present.
Councilmember Arenas. Vice Mayor Jones.
Here.
Councilmember Carrasco. Chair Raul Perales.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. There's no recommended changes on the work plan. My colleagues are comfortable with that. If we get a motion to approve.
Move to approve the work plan. Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. We have one item on consent. We don't have any speaker cards. I don't see anybody in the audience besides staff.
Move to approve the consent item. Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. We're now down to item D1, our Public Safety Communications Interoperability Annual Report.
Good morning, Vice Mayor, council members, city staff, and members of the public. My name is Andy Smith. I'm the Interoperability Communications Manager. I work in the police department. And the three interoperable projects that are presented today are the SVRCS radio system, FirstNet, and the SVRIA data exchange project. I'm pleased to announce that the central cell in the SVRCS system has been completed. Coyote Peak was online early November or late October. It has been tested, verified, and accepted by SVRIA and is complete. I participated and oversaw some of the testing that went on between city staff, police and fire, and Motorola. The cell passed with flying colors. The way they test these is that they go into every quarter square mile, they call it a tile, and you do a little bit of can you hear me now, and then they also do some analysis with some equipment for what they call bit error rate, so to make sure that the system is performing as designed. Of the 3,700 or so square tiles that were analyzed, only one had a problem. And that was with the machines and equipment. If you were to remove some of the filtering equipment, the quarter square mile in North San Jose performs just fine. So the other cells are also complete and were tested. And again, there's no competition, but our cell's better than anybody else's. We only had one tile failure, and some of the others had 7, 8 or so. So we did real well, real confident in the performance of the system. That said, there are only 2 sites that are not complete. That is out in Uvis Canyon. It's the red half circles down in the south part of the Santa Clara County. Uvis Canyon and Coyote Lake. Those are in the process of obtaining permits. PG&E is going to power them sometime in February. Should the permitting be completed, it should be done by now, but it's in the final stages. And I think those will be online sometime May, June, but don't hold me to that because of construction and other delays that can always come up. One note for during the power safety shutdowns, we were able to maintain not only city infrastructure, but SVRCS infrastructure through those power outages, through maintaining the backup power and fueling that was necessary to do that. Public Works is working on a budget proposal, I believe, to enhance or actually monitor, because there is no monitoring in place currently. The only monitoring of fuel levels and generator run time is physically go to those sites and look at the gauge. So it's important that we are able to remotely see what the fuel level is and which power backup is employed in terms of battery backup versus generator, as well as tank capacity. We can look at a tank and say that it should run for 36 hours if it's full. Well, we don't know if it started full or not, and we did have one run out of fuel at the 33-hour mark, and the battery backup took over until we could fuel it. So monitoring is going to be key moving forward with the ongoing public safety power shutdowns. With that, we're in some of the final stages of procuring the last radios that we need to go live. Currently, we have a little north of 2,900 radios in the city's possession. We have some grant funding and other opportunities to continue to procure the radios that we do need to finally go live, and those are in some of the final stages of grant approvals. Roughly about 146 radios between police and fire are still needed. Some of that is due to increased staff in the police department, as well as some training requirements in the fire department, as well as fire department apparatus. As we did programming, some stuff showed up that was old and outdated and couldn't be programmed and needed to be replaced. So as of today, that's the remaining count for radios that need to be purchased. The police department is targeting roughly sometime in February to switch on to the system, and the fire department is targeting mid to, on or before July 1st. Second project is FirstNet, and FirstNet is coming along. We've reported previously that AT&T has won the contract, is in the process of building out the FirstNet or Band 14 sites. To date, there is roughly 73 in the city of San Jose and approximately 174 sites within the county. AT&T has advertised that they're about 75% through their build nationwide, and they're being pretty aggressive here in San Jose because of, partially because of our relationship with them. As you know, we executed a contract on June 25th to be the first city in the nation to be all in for public safety, as well as primary extended users on the FirstNet. And the charter was signed in October, and some of the initial phones were deployed late October, roughly 20 to 25 per department that's participating right now, and that would be the police, fire, OEM, city manager's office, and public works. We're going to continue to monitor the build out and monitor the build out to confirm that it is going as planned. AT&T had promised roughly 100 sites in San Jose by the end of this month or the end of this year, and we'll be meeting with them in January to assess their progress. The last project is the SVRA data exchange. There's not much to report on it. It has had starts and stops over the years, including a vendor that walked away with a sizable amount of money that was supplied to do some work, and it is now gaining some traction. It's kind of the same people running the SVRCS are running the SVR DEC, so now that the radio system is coming to completion, I believe that the bandwidth is now available and is being picked up by Heather Plamanda, and she was a former SVRIA director, executive director. She's now the director at County Communications. And that's been really, I think, a blessing for both the radio system and the data exchange project, because there was a lot of plates spinning in the air. She was able to keep them spinning and then hand them off to herself, and she's really what drove in the last year the completion of a lot of the sites from the county end. So with that, again, we participate in the, we have on the board of directors, Vice Mayor Jones, and the working committee. I hold a seat on the working committee, and then Judy Chirico holds a seat on the Bay Ricks board of directors. One thing to note with Bay Ricks and the new radio system is that it is compatible with the 5 other systems in the county, or 5 other counties: Alameda County, Contra Costa County, San Mateo, San Francisco, and soon Marin. We are working on an MOU and an agreement as to how we can operate on each other's radio systems for mutual aid and interoperability. We right now have pretty much a handshake on how to do that, but we wanted to put that into writing and memorialize that. So that's one of the things Bay Ricks is working on at the moment. Finally, we provide updates on the communication system and FirstNet in 2 places right now: one, the smart cities, and here. It's staff's recommendation to avoid the duplication to move this report due to the fact of the progress it's made, and it is somewhat nearing completion. Move that to the Smart Cities roadmap updates out of PISFIS. Any questions?
Thank you very much for the report, and I actually do agree with the recommendation there at the end, but have appreciated seeing the the progress and the updates throughout this process. Looking forward to everything coming online, at least with a lot of the new radios coming into everybody's hands next year. You had mentioned there's still a small number of radios needing to be purchased. Are those expected to be purchased and had on hand before they go in operation? I think you said the police department was in a couple months and fires in mid next year.
That's a great question. Yes, the fire department's going to have the radios definitely in hand. We do maintain a cache for paid jobs reserves. We could go live without 100% of those radios in terms of the cache that we're comfortable with. If we had half of the cache that we anticipated, we would do fine. So, like I said, we do believe we're going to get final clearance from UASI to make one of our last final purchases, and hopefully that's in the next week or two. Get that order in. It takes about 6 weeks to get the radios, get them programmed, and again, they're going to end up in a cache.
Okay, great. No other questions from me? Vice Mayor?
Yes, so as you mentioned, I sit on the board as well as Smart Cities as well as PISVIS, so definitely feel like I get a lot of content and information. I did want to go back to the power shutdown. Thank you for going into what our plan was, our backup plan in terms of when that happens, but those were really short-term solutions and workarounds. If we have an extended power shutdown, can you kind of walk me through what our strategy is?
Absolutely. So again, long-term, we could use the monitoring, modern monitoring techniques that would tell us when generators come on, when they attempt to start and don't start. We also monitor environmentals. In other words, the radio equipment needs to stay cool. So if an air conditioning unit, for instance, goes down and the equipment overheats, that's an issue. So long-term, the monitoring is going to be key to really managing those power safety shutdowns or even a midwinter power outage. Currently, right now, the strategy is once a generator starts, that we're going to go out and look at it within 24 hours and make that necessary order for propane or diesel. Some of these sites are running on propane. It's hard to spin up a propane vendor, especially when everybody's looking for propane during a power outage. Mm-hmm. We do have a good relationship with one of the vendors, and we leverage that when we knew we needed it. So there was a positive ending to that one. So we are learning as we go, but in terms of preparing for the power safety shutdowns, once we know they're there, we confirm the fuel and are positioned to continuously supply fuel as needed.
Great. That's my only question. Thank you for your report.
Vice Chair Jimenez?
Yeah, I just had a question. If you can go back to slide 3. I just had a question about something you had on there. I think as it relates to the authorized number of radios and the required number. So there's authorized radios for San Jose 3,000 and then purchased to date 2,901. And obviously the remaining radios to be purchased 146. I guess the question I have is the current radios needed to go live. And so are we going to need to authorize more radios above the 3,000 in order to go live?
So currently, right now, that's a great question. It's probably hasn't come to the executive board for SVRIA yet, and that's a bit of a moving target. So is what SVRIA does is they true up at the end of every year, and then they bill accordingly. So we're not sure. We're not the only agency that is going to have more radios than they've signed up for. And when we have a better picture of what that's going to look like, we'll bring that back to staff. As a participating agency since day one, it's believed that going over a minor amount will not be too difficult to manage. In other words, obviously the annual subscriptions will stay this, will be per radio. Mm-hmm. Whether or not a buy-in for those radios into the system now that it's complete is going to be required, and what that amount is hasn't been decided at the SVRIA executive board level.
Okay. I guess what came to mind for me is just wondering, not until we get there, we can't go live, and I'm just wondering what impediments that creates with only authorized within San Jose 3,000.
So that won't cause an impediment to
Okay.
go live. We can go over that amount, that number.
Okay.
It's just that we're going to have to follow the direction of the SVRA board to figure out the financial piece of that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no other questions or comments, if we can get a motion to approve.
I move to approve.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None. Motion passes. Thank you very much. And we won't see you here again.
Thank you. I won't take that personal.
All right, we're on to item D2, our Retirement Plans Investments Annual Report.
Good morning. Prabhu Palani, Chief Investment Officer of the Office of Retirement Services, and I have with me Brian Starr, Senior Investment Officer. So there are two attachments to this agenda item. The first is a memo that recommends for your consideration the returns of the retirement system for fiscal year 2019. And I actually have a presentation that I will go over, which actually outlines our investment strategy for the plans with some updated numbers through September 30th, 2019. Excuse me. So the first chart here shows global sovereign rates. Sorry about that. And excuse me. As you can see from this chart, this shows 10-year sovereign bond yields for the major developed economies of the world. And this informs, so the low interest rate environment that we are in actually informs the way we actually manage our assets. And I will talk a little bit about our current asset allocation later. But this is a very important chart. This shows what a low interest rate environment we have been in for the past several years. And as you can see from this chart, the US 10-year bond yield at the time of making the chart was about 1.5. This morning it was 1.89%. It's still a very low yield. And in Japan and in Germany, you can see that those rates are actually negative. So that's the environment we are in. Extremely low and in some cases negative yielding bond rates. And I'll talk about the relevance of that in a little while. On this next chart, you can see the percent of sovereign yields that are actually negative yielding globally, and it's fully 56% of the world's government bond yields are actually negative yielding. So the government actually pays you, you pay the government rather, for actually lending out your money. And that's the rate in which we are operating. Bank of America actually put out an excellent interest rate chart going back over time. It actually goes back to the year 1790. And if you go back 240 years, you'll see that never in our history have rates been so low for such an extended period of time. The only previous time was World War II, when rates actually dipped below 2%, and that was for a brief time. So we've really been in a declining interest rate environment, and that poses a lot of challenges as we try to manage our retirement assets. So as you can see from this chart, this shows that the expected returns from a simple 65-35 allocation, 65% to equities and 35% to bonds. And over time, you can see in 1980, that would have actually given you an expected return of 15.6%. And you can see the decline in 85, it was 14.2%, in 1990, 9.5%, and so on, all the way to 2019, when all you can expect from that is 6%. But more importantly, you look at the last line of that row, which shows the probability of earning 7.5%. So not only is your expected return going to be low, the chance of achieving it is also much lower, simply because now, instead of just investing in bonds, which are a guaranteed return, you're now increasing your equity mix, right? And therefore, there's a greater volatility in returns. And therefore, the probability of earning that is now only 32% as opposed to 99% in 1980. And this chart was actually borrowed from the Wall Street Journal, and this shows what should your asset mix be to earn 7.5%, right? In 1995, you could have been 100% in bonds, and you could have earned 7.5% guaranteed. In fact, you may have read that Chairman Paul Volcker of the Federal Reserve passed away yesterday. When he was the Federal Reserve Chairman, interest rates were very high. And so he's credited for actually breaking the back of inflation. But in the 80s, you could actually simply, if we had our retirement assets, you could have simply locked it in by investing in bonds, and it would have returned a guaranteed 7.5%. But over time, with declining interest rates, what it has forced us to do is to take on more risk assets. So if you go from 95 to 2005, you can see that to earn that same 7.5%, now you can only be 52% in bonds, and you'll have to invest in non-US equities, real estate, and private equity. And if you move forward to 2015, you can see how that mix has changed. Now only 12% bonds, and you need a mix of these risk assets simply to get that 7.5%. And at the same time, the risk of your portfolio goes up dramatically. You can see that row that mentions standard deviation, which is the volatility of the plan. And so that went in 1995 from 6% to in 2015, 17.2%. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here on this chart. This basically shows expected returns from a variety of sources. And in coming up with our asset allocation strategy, we do come up with, we do use the capital market assumptions of our general consultant, Makita, which is the far right 2 columns, 10-year and 20-year. But we do go and, we poll other market participants and thought leaders as well. And what I would draw from this chart is, as you can see, that global equity and US equity and emerging markets equity, you can see the expected returns. And generally, those returns are lower than they have been in the past. And we are in a very high valuation environment currently. And so the conclusion from this chart is, if we've been in a bull market in the last 10 years, going forward, we have to be cautious with our expectations from our pension plans. So asset allocation, I've spoken about this many times before in front of the council. This is the single most important determinant of return. And 91% of all returns actually come from simply which asset class we are in. Are we in bonds, or are we in equity or real estate, and so on. And the balance of, have you picked the right manager only contributes to less than 10% of the return. So it's important to be in the right asset class. And so the boards and the investment team spend a lot of time in thinking about asset allocation. And this chart shows our current asset allocation. And we've divided our assets into 3 different buckets: growth, zero beta, and other. The growth assets are those assets that in a booming economy, as the stock market does well, you'll actually expect returns from these assets, and they include public equity, private markets, private equity, private debt, real estate, and so on. And the zero beta or low beta assets are those assets that have low correlation to the market. And this is really a risk dampener. And as you can see from that, given our lower risk stance, you can see that fully 1/4 of the assets are in low beta or zero beta assets, primarily cash, immunized cash, which is treasury bills and treasury notes, and short-term investment grade bonds. And the other bucket is really those assets that protect us primarily against inflation and include core real estate, commodities, and treasury inflation protected securities. So with this asset allocation, you can see that our 10-year expected return is roughly 7.5%. Our 20-year expected return is 8%, with a standard deviation of 12.5%. And just as a reminder, our discount rate currently for both plans is 6.75%. And I know this is a question that comes up often is, the fees that we pay for the plans and the percent of assets that are passively managed. And we have increased the passive allocation in our plan. And as of the end of last year, roughly half our assets were in passive vehicles. The next chart simply shows in the memo, we have returns through fiscal year ending June 30th, 2019. Since we do have numbers, for September 30th, the next two charts actually show updated numbers, quarter to date, fiscal year to date, and year to date. So the calendar year to date numbers are 9% return for the Federated City Employees Retirement System. And the fiscal year to date, which is really, the first quarter of this current fiscal year, was 0.1%. And this compares to a policy benchmark, which is 0.2% for fiscal year to date. And for the calendar year to date, the policy benchmark was 8.6%. And the next chart shows the police and fire department returns. Again, year to date, that's calendar year to date, the returns were 8.7% compared to our policy benchmark of 8%. And fiscal year to date, which is really the first quarter of fiscal year 2020, the plans returned 0.4% compared to the policy benchmark of 0.4%. With that, I will actually conclude my formal remarks. There are some other charts in the appendix for your perusal, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Any questions from my colleagues? Yes, Vice Mayor Jones.
I also want to say thank you for the presentation, too. I can tell that we've been through these discussions quite a bit because you nailed a lot of my potential questions in your presentation. So thank you for that.
Sure.
I'm one of the people that keeps bringing up the whole issue in the allocation between active and passive. And I appreciate that we're shifting our strategy to have a larger percentage of passive investments. Are we going to continue that trend to move towards passive, or is the 50-50 combined split the
Yeah, no, that's a great question. 50% is actually quite a big number to be in passive assets. And I'll actually go back to slide 8. If we can pull up slide 8. Actually, so we could have all passive assets, right? Potentially, we could have 100% in passive assets. So if you look at this chart, this shows the current asset allocation versus a passive global 60-40. And as you can see, the expected returns on a 10-year basis are lower in a fully passive strategy by 110 basis points and by 90 basis points on a 20-year basis. And these are expected returns after fees, after paying for manager fees. And so since our current discount rate is 6.75%, the boards have made a conscious decision to actually invest in certain asset classes like private markets, where you cannot actually get passive exposure. So in private markets, if we are able to get passive exposure, we could do that potentially. And maybe that time will come because there is a lot of focus on fees, not just at San Jose, but all over. But at the moment, those vehicles are not there. And therefore, we do invest in certain active managers to get exposure to private markets. But I would say, I don't know what our peer number is, but the 50% is a fairly large number for passive allocation.
So what you're telling me then is the active investment component is the delta between the global 60-40 and what we're currently getting in the 10-year, or a 20-year expected return for the federal and police and fire policies. So the delta or the gap is the value that they're providing in terms of their
That's right, that's right,
investment.
that's right. And these are expected returns going forward, yeah.
I wanted to also ask about a concept that came out of our the meeting that we had, the joint meeting with the boards, and one of the members threw out the concept of one of our challenges in terms of our asset allocations is the fact that we have obligations to pay out our retirees, which limits our options in terms of our investment strategy.
Right.
So he raised the idea of having some type of bond to literally finance the periodic shortfalls
Right.
in cash availability.
Right.
That would give us the flexibility to have a more aggressive
Yes.
investment strategy. I don't know if you remember that
Yes, I do,
conversation.
yes.
But it's one of those ideas that just kind of, it stuck with me. And I thought it was a really intriguing concept, and I wanted to get your thoughts
Yeah,
on that.
I think it's not a new idea, the concept of pension obligation bonds. It's been around for a while. Some municipalities have used it with great success, and others have failed in doing it. It all depends on when you borrow that money and how you deploy it. But I think that's certainly something that we should consider and discuss. And if you're familiar with the Mayor's Retirement Working Group, in fact, we have that on the agenda for February to talk about pension obligation bonds, because I don't think there's too many, I don't think we have too many bullets left to solve this, but that's one of them. And I think we should seriously explore and think about it. I think it's a good idea. It all depends on how we utilize it and how we deploy those assets.
And if I can add in, so Julia Cooper is preparing for February to bring that analysis. We did do an analysis back when we were doing the 3-year general fund deficit solutions. We found it to be quite risky on the administrative side, so we did not recommend it at that time. But she will update the analysis and bring that back for that working group's consideration.
Thank you. And actually, I've been familiar with or known about the pension obligation bond strategy for a while, but in my mind, it was always borrow money on your credit card to pay your to pay your debts,
Right,
as opposed to a cash flow strategy.
right.
So that was the new twist on it that made me kind of think, okay, maybe that's something that we should at least explore or reconsider.
I think it's a valid, it could be a valid strategy because the city is paying, so there's the UAL, the unfunded liability, and we are paying a 6.75% interest on that, right? So if we can borrow a bond where the coupon is much lesser than that, there's an arbitrage there that will directly fall into our bottom line. Now, the reason it has failed with some other municipalities is they've borrowed that money, and instead of actually investing it in fixed income, they've actually gone and invested in equities at the wrong time. And so it all depends on how you deploy the proceeds. So I think there is a legitimate argument for the strategy, and I think it can be conservatively managed where you simply take that interest rate differential, and it's an arbitrage that we can gain from. But we will discuss that at the retirement working group.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I was able to join this last retirement solutions working group meeting, and will be present in all the upcoming ones. And so I look forward to that discussion. And certainly, as you pointed out, we don't have many other options remaining, so we do need to explore whatever is available. One topic that came up in that discussion that I'll look forward to hearing a little bit more about was the idea of sort of a buyout on retirements, which we don't offer today, but I know obviously a lot of private companies do. I don't know how that helps or hurts, so I'm interested in sort of hearing that as well in regards to again, the limited number of options that we have ahead of us. So I don't have any other questions on this. Thank you for the update. And seeing none from my colleagues and no comments, if we can get a motion to approve the report. Motion to approve. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you.
And our last item, item D3, our Mayor's Game Prevention Task Force Audit Implementation Status Report.
Good afternoon. Neil Rufino, Deputy Director, Parks Recreation Neighborhood Services. I'm joined here with Israel Kanhura, who is our new Recreation Superintendent for Youth Intervention and Mayor's Game Prevention Task Force, as well as CJ Ryan, our Program Manager for the San Jose BEST program. I do want to note that we have Lieutenant Shaw with the Police Department here to help answer any questions, as well as Mario Maciel, our Division Manager, who has always been our heart and leader for the Youth Intervention Services and the Mayor's Game Prevention Task Force. And with that, I will go into the presentation. Oops, sorry, I am off. Okay. The audit itself made 17 recommendations, and the department has agreed to all of them. We have committed to implementing all the changes by July of 2021. These recommendations need to be woven into our current work plans. PRNS is constantly looking for ways to improve and better our service to the community. With these audit recommendations that have been provided to us, they will help us do just that. Today, we are giving you an update on the audit recommendations that we have completed, as well as the progress that we've made, including those recommendations that came from Council at the June 4th meeting. And with that, I will turn over the presentations to Israel and CJ for the details.
Good morning. On this slide, you can see that of the 17 audit recommendations, 4 have already been completed. We do expect another one that we've made significant progress on to be done in the next month, leaving the rest of them to be done by July of 2021. Though not shown on this slide, we'll go over today, of the 9 recommendations that came from Council on June 4th, we have completed 5 of them. So to go over the completed audit recommendations, audit recommendation number 5 is to ensure that intensive services are targeted to the appropriate population. In the next agreement cycle, the department should revise best grantee agreements such that goals for services across target populations are clearly defined. So what the auditor's report highlighted is that in some of the agreements with our community-based organizations, there was a mismatch between the target population that was contracted for and the target population that was actually served. So for example, an agency may have been contracted to provide services to gang-impacted youth, whereas the actuals after the fact showed they actually provided services to high-risk youth. So in order to help prevent that from happening and to help with the monitoring, our team updated the grant agreements, and you can see a sample on the slide, where we include a table that highlights the target populations intended for activities in each eligible service area. So we think this is going to help both the grantees and our analysts with clarity on the intent of the agreement and to help monitor that agreement.
In regards to the audit recommendation number 9, the auditors wanted us to review the annually the incident reports for all our schools, and they also wanted us to align our school visits based on the analysis of that information. And so that this year, what we were able to do was to take into consideration all of the incidents that we had per school, and then what we did was that We then segregated all the, we ranked them from highest number of incidents to lowest number of incidents. And then we determined that, those schools with the most incidents, 9+, would get approximately 3 visits per week. Schools with 3 to 8 incidents would get approximately 2 visits per week, and those with less than 2 incidents would get 1 visit per week. Again, this is just a model that we have in place to address, to give staff, our youth intervention staff, guidance as to how we expect them to work with the schools. But our mechanism is dynamic, meaning that every week at times things may shift for each of the schools that we serve. Some of the schools in maybe that have 2 or less incidents, their incident levels may spike up on that week. So we need to have a dynamic model that doesn't really, that makes sure that those schools that have incidents or higher incidents that week, we can maneuver our staff and deploy resources as necessary. And we also work with our best grantees to also ensure that we have the right support mechanisms. And those are the things that our coordinators do.
So the next 2 that have been completed are audit recommendations 11 and 13, and they also relate to the best programs monitoring procedures. Both of these recommendations were completed early compared to our initial target date. Recommendation number 11 was for the department to revise and implement additional monitoring procedures and instructions for reviewing best quarterly workbooks and grantee site visits, to include reviewing workbooks for duplicates and target populations served, and having consistent guidelines on when grantees should be placed on a corrective action plan. And recommendation 13 was for the department to revise its site visit checklist to include contracted grantee scope of work and verification of key requirements, including backgrounding. So all of these items have been completed. Our team initially targeted July 2020 for the tasks so we could work it into our current work plan. But what prompted us to make these changes early is that late this summer, we had some staff turnover on our best analyst team, and we're onboarding 2 new best analysts. And we realized this was the time for us to revisit those procedures, onboard our new analysts with the new procedures and monitoring guidelines to include these items. So this year, the 1920 school year, we will have these monitoring procedures in place. They've been updated so that our new analysts are going to be reviewing the prior year's contract results, the target population alignment, the background check compliance, and the financial dashboard review, in addition to all of the standard site visit items that were already in place. We've also updated our monitoring guidelines to include clear and consistent thresholds for developing corrective action plans with the grantees. So now to go through some of the items that were completed based on the direction from Council on June 4th. So the first item was to update recommendation 15 to create a young adult membership or stakeholder position on the task force's policy team. We're checking this off as complete because we've gone back, we've changed that recommendation 15 to include that item. Recommendation 15, though, we're still counting as in progress, and we'll speak to that in a little bit. The second item on here is to cross-reference the audit report to the policy team meeting. This audit report was presented and discussed at the August 22nd policy team meeting, so we're checking this off as complete as well. The third item from the Jones-Arenas memorandum recommended that the Safe School Campus Initiative services be realigned for the upcoming 1920 school year, and as Israel spoke just a moment ago for recommendation 9, the department has conducted that analysis and got it in place in time for the 1920 school year. The fourth item on this list is the audit implementation update that we are doing right now. And the fifth item is for staff to report on the feasibility of segmenting future grants by target population profile. So as stated in the memorandum, right now we distribute funding based on eligible service area as approved by the policy team. Since we're in the first year of this 3-year triennial, we think it would be the most fair to keep it that way for the next 2 years at least. But an even more significant reason that we're recommending that we wait on distributing grants by target population profile is that recommendation 4, which I'll speak to on the next slide, is to implement a standard assessment tool. And that assessment tool may actually have an impact on how we define the target populations. So we want to wait until that is in place before we adjust how we allocate our grant funding. So we'll speak to the key recommendations that are in progress. This first one, standardizing the risk assessment tool. That recommendation was made with the intent of making sure that participant needs are consistently assessed across programs so that we're targeting the right population and assigning services appropriately. So we were tasked, or the auditors made the recommendation that we adopt a standardized assessment tool to be used for all of the task force programming. So over the last several months, Israel and my teams have begun to explore the best practices in the field. What we're learning is that this task is more complex and there are more unknowns than we had initially assessed. And as we've looked for an assessment tool to be used with youth violence programs, there isn't a standard off-the-shelf assessment tool that could easily be applied to all of the varied programs that the task force encompasses. So one of the challenges with this task is that our 4 profiles, the at-risk, high-risk, gang-impacted, gang-intentional, they were created by our predecessors and they were based on very solid evidence, but they were made unique to San Jose and they weren't linked to a specific assessment tool that had already been created. And so we've relied on our programs and our grantees to incorporate that identification into their own assessment forms and their own intake tools. But as the auditors point out, this doesn't make sure that it's standardized across all of the programs. We have looked at the tools that Los Angeles uses, that Oakland uses, and both have assessment tools that are unique to their programs and their needs, and they don't match with our target population profile. It's not a simple sort of cut and paste from their program to ours. The other challenge that we're facing with this, and that we'll get through, but it will take us some time, is the fact that we have a wide range of programs that vary in their intensity and in their style of interaction with the youth. So on one hand, we've got intense programs such as one-on-one case management. On the other programs, we've got, they're much lighter touch, so late night gym or the group programs that we have in BEST. So in the programs that provide space for that one-on-one interaction, such as the case management, those might be suited to something like the CANS, which is the Children and Adolescent Needs Strength Survey. We've looked into this. The CANS is an assessment tool that's used by the county probation department and other social service providers. And so after an interview with the youth, the individual's needs and their strengths are given a score, and a service plan can be developed from that score. So we're considering the use of the CANS for our one-on-one programs, but its structure isn't quite appropriate for those programs that are lighter touch or that are group-based. So we're continuing to research other options. We're gathering quotes from a few consultants to determine the cost of developing an assessment tool that would be specific to the task force programs. And so as we continue to work on this, we're still aiming for that completion date of July 2021.
In regards to the discussion around the name change for the Mayor's Gang Prevention Task Force, per the blue memo of Councilmember Chappie Jones and Arenas, I'm happy to say that we've embarked on that already. We convened a group at the direction of the policy team at the August 26th meeting. That group convened and they gave us some instructions as to or strategies that we could use to actually move forward with that. And to that end, we've met with several stakeholders already. For example, PACT, we met with them. We met with Youth Advisory Council, Youth Advisory Board, and they provided some great insight into a new name change for the task force. We're still exploring and meeting with other groups. For example, we will be meeting with Debug. We will be meeting with Black Kitchen Cabinet. And so we still have those meetings to have. In addition to that, we'll then, before the March meeting of the policy team, where we're going to make that recommendation of a new name change, we will be doing a survey with all of the stakeholder groups and asking them to rate, to rank the names of those individuals, and then we're going to take the top 3 names to the policy team for their last recommendation. In regards to recommendation 14, and again, 17, 14, we're currently in the process, again, of reviewing and working with CJ's team, with the consultants, to help us see how we can, program by program, develop some outcomes and units of service measurements. We do some of that already. However, we want to make sure that we refine those, and that will take some time. We will need to get a quote from the consultant to help us determine that. But again, we have some time to do that, and we're making sure that we do things correctly. Just because of the fact that our programs are, like CJ alluded to, they're all very different. And just like the Clean Slate program, how do we determine the outcome on that program? And what's an effective outcome? And so we want to make sure that we have all those aligned, and so therefore we will need some help around that. In regards to recommendation number 17, which is to develop a formal process and guidelines on the reserve fund spending, we've already, our current analyst is working on a draft for our director to review, and we'll have that ready by the due date in January 2020.
So with that, that concludes our updates that we'll make today. We do have other updates, of course, included in the memorandum. One thing that I will add is that in order to make sure that we stay on our timeline, Israel and my team, our team of analysts, ourselves, we are meeting every other week to make sure that we're continuing to make traction on each of these items. And as issues come up, we'll of course escalate them as needed, but at this point, when we look at the timeline, we do believe we can complete all of the items by July of 2021. And we're open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions from my colleagues? Vice Mayor Jones.
I don't really have any questions. I just want to say thank you for that update and working on all of the different items and the progress that you've been making. I'm looking forward to the conclusion of this whole effort and seeing what our outcomes are in terms of a better program. And I'm really excited about, hearing some of the suggestions about the new name as well. So thank you for that report and all the good work.
Look to my colleagues on my right. Yeah, Vice Chair Jimenez, no? Councilmember Arenas? And I'm sorry, if there's anybody in the public that would like to speak, you can just indicate by filling out a yellow card. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I do have a couple of comments and questions. And since you, Israel, since you ended at the outcomes, I'll start there. I'm really pleased to see that you're moving forward in this. I just want to add one more thing to the mix, and that is tomorrow, Friday, yeah, it is Friday, we're going to talk about our equity lens. And I think it's really important in this segment of the population to also apply the framework that I know that you are already probably working within, and that as policymakers, we're beginning to take a look at and starting to develop what that means for us as policymakers, for our residents, and more importantly, for our programs and our services. And so I know that you said you have some outcomes. I just would like to make a recommendation there is a logic model, and I'm sure that you all know about it. It just talks about the inputs and outputs and activities that can accomplish certain outcomes, right? And added to that is the theory of change. So you can get outcomes pretty clean cut, but we don't know whether they're effective from a logic model, right? We have to figure out what is working, and so you make an evaluation of those initiatives or those strategies at different points in time to figure out what is actually working for our youth. And so the theory of change evaluation helps us determine what is actually effective, right? You even went, when you were talking about the different 4 categories that your predecessors had established in terms of youth and the level of youth. You said that you didn't find any conformity within other programs. It was very specific to San Jose. And I appreciate, that the tailoredness of that, but I also think that we need to find some of the standards that are out there so that we can also see the effectiveness of our programs, right? Especially as you're making these huge movements. And so I'd like to see, whether you use a logic model and a theory of change, it doesn't matter to me. It's just something that tells you, one, what are the outcomes that you're looking for, and 2, what is an effective strategy that you're going to utilize for the different levels, and if you want to, when you decide if those different levels are the most adequate, and not because you inherited them from others, but that you see them fit for our city and for our youth, and for our purposes, right, for the outcomes that we want to look at. So I would encourage you to dig in a little bit deeper into that, and also taking a look at our equity lens. And my comment ties back into the name change. A lot of the times, right now we have the Mayor's Gang Task Force. And to me, we're making the gang the problem, right? Gangs are the problem, but the reality is that the systems that have failed those children are the problem, and they are at our door in terms of trouble. And so, we could rename it really the mayor's or the city's failure of systems youth task force is what it would be if we're really getting down to the nitty-gritty. I'm all for a name change. I just want us to also shift into also thinking about how the systems are affecting our children and those policies that have been established, and versus making the gangs and our youth the problem at hand. And we saw the youth coming up and rising and really speaking up at our last policy team meeting, where they were talking about they really pushed back in terms of being criminalized and being accused of a lot of the burglaries and the kind of the hike in the crime. And I'm very aware of where they're coming from, and I want us to be very sensitive to that, because that voice that they're finding, there's truth to that. And so I want our programs to also react to it, and to not react, but really respond and be receptive to it, and take a look at how our systems are getting them to where they are at the moment, and not necessarily themselves, because the problem isn't the gangs. The problem is the lack of education, the lack of all of the systems that come into play, whether it's our own society, whether it's the schools, the school district, our own, the county. Those are the systems that have failed those youth, that have landed them where they are at that moment. And unfortunately, it's the gang life. So I really want us to create a shift there, so that we are not blaming the very youth that we're trying to help. And so, whether it's and I really like Vice Mayor's name, but I want us to take a look at what folks, especially the youth that came out, in terms of what they are saying. I know that you're meeting with the stakeholders. Those are all stakeholders that they're adults, right? They might have gone through some of these issues, or they might have had failures of the systems within their own lives. But I really want us to connect with the youth to hear what their voice and what they would like to see it called. To me, it doesn't really matter what it is. I know that sometimes we connect with a name because at the heart of it is the passion that lies, and I'm looking at Mario because he's been there, and Neil, of course, he's been there since like 20 years ago when I first started and I was in youth intervention. And we all maybe connect with the name because it talks about the passion and the love and the compassion that we have for our youth. But we really need to start taking a look at how words really matter. I'm not going to say I don't have a suggestion. I would really love to hear the youth say what they would like. So those are my recommendations in terms of when the outcome to the name, which is, superficially they're just outcomes and names, but really what I want it to look at is the relevancy and inequity, and taking a look at how do we start in this shift that we're making with this particular program. How are we also incorporating that equity lens into the work that we do? Because this is a really good opportunity as we're all discussing this and as you're revamping a lot of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So thank you so much for the work that you've done so far. I heard loud and clear you have 4 of them done. There's some progress in others. There's really good progress. I know good change sometimes just takes a long time. You have to stew it and sit with it and hear people out. And that kind of participation takes some time, and so I respect it. And as long as it doesn't matter how long it takes, it matters that we have the right, when the right outcomes, the right indicators, the right strategies, the right everything for our youth in San Jose. So thank you so much.
Councilmember Renz, I just want to respond and thank you for those comments. One thing, as you know, the Gang Task Force and Youth Intervention, we've always been operating on this continuum of services, and continue for us to drive to figure out what is it that's going to make these young kids successful. It has always been our primary mission. One of the challenges that CJ mentioned, as when we talk to cities across the nation about what their examples or best practices are, a lot of times they actually come back and look at us and say, because we have led, through Mario and the team for years as a national model. And in the conversations, they're like, also, when you find out, call us back and let us know. So, we have full confidence, in the team and the dedication they have on ensuring that no one is giving up on these kids. The other point, as we walk into the equity study session tomorrow, I do want to let you know that Israel Olympia, who is leading our Beautify SJ program, and myself have been part of the city's GARE team for the last 2 years, Israel and Olympia for the last year. And our department has been actively looking at ways for us internally and how to import that. CJ, in terms of all her work with our contracts, has been an active participant in those conversations with us as a department. So I want to thank you for those comments.
And thank you for responding to that, Neil. And my intention is always to be supportive, and so I appreciate that you've done some wonderful work, and I know that we've led in this area for the last 20 years in terms of strategies, in terms of service and quality of care for our youth. And so I'm looking forward to where we're going to go in the direction that we're heading, because we're going to continue to break ground here.
Councilmember Carrasco.
Thank you. Thank you so much, by the way, for the work that you're all doing. And I want to acknowledge also Mario and the rest of your team. As Councilmember Arena said, for the past 20 years or so, but especially this is such a difficult population. And I know that the numbers have looked very dramatically different 20 years ago than what they look like now. And it's a testament to the work that has been done over the years, and sometimes you don't see the results immediately. It's laying out the foundation, it's planting the seeds, and then waiting to see what blossoms. And hopefully, in the process, the harvest hasn't been ruined, but rather we have a bountiful harvest. And so, and it's because of all of the folks that have come through parks and rec programs, our different directors, our different staff, through the Mayor's Gang Task Force, everyone that's been here really providing leadership and commitment, and a lot of folks that we never see because we're not meant to see them because of the nature of the work. So I'm very appreciative of it. Just a couple of things that I wanted to ask about. One is, in terms of the name change, you know, I go back and forth in my head about this, and I haven't weighed in on it yet. And I hear what Councilmember Arenas is saying, and a lot of folks have echoed the same sentiment that Councilmember Arenas has just expressed. So before we go there, what are the plans in terms of what we're going to do regarding that? There must be some aggressive outreach that we're going to do, or some research. I think we have to be very careful in terms of the direction that we go in, because we've been a model, not just for the state of California, but we've been an international model. We keep getting called into DC to speak on what we do here. So what we do from here on out, including the name of this model, is going to be so pivotal. And so what are the plans regarding this?
So like I stated before, that we're meeting with stakeholders, community stakeholders. We met with PACT, met with some of the youth. And to be honest with you, when we met with the youth of the youth advisory boards, they told us about the name and the negativity that they were hearing in regards to the name. And what they were asking us to do is to choose names that have like words like empowerment, like very positive words, right? So that's encouraging to hear youth say those things, right? Because they're looking at it not only from our perspective, but they're looking at it from their own perspective, right? Like this is the first time they're hearing about the name, and they're like just expressing as to like what sentiment or the feelings that it invokes in them. And so being able to sit with them and hear them out is really good, right? And so we're meeting with the group that Fly has, and we're also going to try to meet with other groups of youth to give them an opportunity to weigh in on the name, but always knowing that first and foremost, at the end of the day, you know, the name is one thing, but when the mission and the vision around the task force, I think will speak to the work that we're going to be focused on. And I think that alludes to almost everything that we talk about in terms of diluting the resources for the most needed youth. I don't see the youth saying those things. In fact, what I'm hearing them say is that they want to feel that they're empowered. And those are the type of words that they're using to like basically to tell us and to guide us, right? At the end of the day, you know, we're going to bring forth those the different names to all the groups and have them give us their input. And then at the end, we're going to meet with the policy team, and we'll bring it forth to the policy team and hear their recommendation as to like what they would like us to do. But again, this is a process, right? A long process for doing this.
Thank you. I'm processing some of that myself, and I appreciate that. I'm really glad that you're especially meeting with the very kiddos that we're aiming to serve, and that we're hoping will be on a path to success and will shape the future of San Jose in a positive way. And if they're that engaged, we need to listen to what they're saying. And it's encouraging if they're that active in terms of expressing themselves. And what may have worked 20 years ago, culture changes, ideals change, and perceptions of even language really changes.
Yeah, and the name of the gang task force came from adults, right? And so at that time, back then, right? So, and what input did youth give at that time to the name, right? So I think that what we want to make sure is that they're part of it, they're part of the decision making, and they're gonna own it, right? Because it came from them. So, I think that we as adults will have names as task force and things of that nature, right? But the youth actually use more simpler words, but they're powerful.
Right, thank you.
Just,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, just to add to
Yeah.
Israel said, I think a lot of the comments that we receive from the youth is for them to be involved in leadership and the solutions around gangs. They didn't necessarily want the agency or the system to help to define themselves. They don't see themselves necessarily in, in the negativity and the title of gangs. They see themselves as young, empowered people, right, that want to make the change. I think our effort as a system is to ensure that we are protecting and providing the resources in the intervention realm of the continuum of care. Prevention side, we have a lot of resources that we work on the recreation side. Suppression side at the end of the continuum, right? We have a lot of resources with the police department and probation. The intervention component, regardless of, I think, the name of the agency that we are doing this, if we are focused on ensuring that we are helping provide those young people at the highest risk, both victimization as well as crimes, and get them to a point where they want to make their change. I think that's the key for that. And I think the information we received around names for the young people is about they want to be inspired and empowered.
Thank you, I like that. So just a few things, and it's not necessarily part of the audit, but I'm gonna just put a bug in your ear so that we can address it in future upcoming meetings. And I'm glad Mario's here because as we meet also on one-on-ones and as we meet on a team, because Hope is coming into Poco Way. And I think that there's a nexus in terms of what we're doing with our, for now we'll call it our Mayor's Gang Prevention Task Force until we find a better name for it. And I've brought this up in the past, but really the nexus between those that we're serving in the task force and those who are struggling in school or who are being picked up by the kiddos are being picked up by the yes, and I think we need to dig deeper. I know that we have some preliminary numbers, but I believe that some of those children would probably greatly benefit from an IEP, and some of them are probably most likely are falling through some huge gaps. And I just want to make sure that we're capturing those children, especially as they get older. They've already lost interest because no one caught on to maybe learning disabilities, which lead to behavioral problems, which then lead to some other situations. But I'm going to continue to harp on this, but that's one. It's just the nexus between the kiddos that we're serving and TABS. So that's one. And what kind of coordination we have with the schools, Eastside Union High School District, Franklin McKinley, Alum Rock, San Jose Unified. We've got to get a handle on that, and I think we really need to dig deep. Getting an IEP is one of the hardest things for a parent that journey is one of the hardest journeys for a parent to maneuver. And many times, if you don't have an educational lawyer to help you get through it, the parents just can't. If you're monolingual, if you're limited English, or if you just easily give up because parents are just overly stressed, the kids won't get an IEP. And so I just have a suspicion about that. The other is, Councilmember Arenas and I have pushed on this issue when it comes to other items, but human trafficking and domestic violence. I want to see what we're doing in terms of helping our youth make sure that they don't fall victims to human trafficking. I just learned of a very unfortunate incident that I don't want to elaborate here on, but it involves a 13-year-old and possibly a family that's deeply rooted in gang culture. And now we don't know where she is. And so, you know, how we can go ahead and address some of these issues while we have them already here. It's a captured audience. Let's not miss opportunities where we can really support our kids and provide the kind of support and education that we already have available to us, and be able to make available to these kiddos, both girls and boys. So human trafficking, domestic violence, and of course, I'm very interested, especially as this has increased females in gangs, the role of females in gangs. I know that before it wasn't such a big deal. It's much more aggressive now. They play a very prominent role. They didn't before, they do now. And last but not least, as we are ending 2019, you know, once January comes along, those next 3-4 months just zoom by, and now we're looking at summer. And for me, getting them into good summer youth employment, internships, and maybe even employment here in City Hall is a must. We've got to figure out how to get these kids into opportunities where they can really develop good skills. So I'll be addressing those as we move forward, but I want to really put that on your list of to-dos and discussions for our future meetings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will echo my appreciation for the update and the progress that you've made. I appreciate that you are engaging the youth that the program is serving as well in regards to the name change. I think we, as you know, sort of developing programs like this, as organizations, government, whoever it may be, we, especially before it exists, you may not necessarily be able to go out and test the naming on the clients that you want to be serving to determine what sort of, you know, what their feeling is in regards to that, on what the program could mean. And it has been in existence for quite some time, and I think it's a benefit that we're now asking that question to the youth that we're serving, and I would say they are the most important voice. I would agree that we should be doing a lot of outreach to different organizations, but quite frankly, and I would tell those organizations that, to me, the most important feedback is from the youth that we actually are going to serve in the program. And if they, you know, feel strongly about what the name might imply or not, and there's a recommendation that the committee can actually take up on changing the name, that's going to be where I weigh at least my decision on. And I think it speaks true to another program that we had that stemmed from sort of the rebirth of Project Crackdown, which again, you know, naming coming from internally, we may have had our indication of why that was the goal, but out in the community, it may not be received in the way that we want it to. And so indeed we revived that as Project Hope, and with good feedback from the community, and I think feedback from all of us. the intent may still be the same, right, on what we're trying to do within a community, but the name could actually add a lot of value. And so I'm interested in that discussion coming forward, and I appreciate that we're not trying to rush that as well. I don't have any other comments or questions, so seeing none from my colleagues. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? None. Motion passes, and we're in the open forum. We have no speakers, so meeting's adjourned. Thank you.